Second session for today. Let me introduce you Beate Krickel from Ruhr University Bochum, and she is going to be talking about mechanisms from metaphysics to explanation. I'm going to leave and come back for the Q&A because I want to see the slides as well.
Okay, thank you, Sven. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and honor for me to be here. So many things I'm going to talk about today, and now a little bit of, thank you, of shameless self-promotion is part of a book I recently published, which is basically a metaphysical analysis of the so-called new mechanistic approach.
Can you try it again?
Yes. So, does it work?
Yes.
No?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So, the so-called new mechanists, they think that mechanisms play an important role in biology and other life sciences. And for those of you who are not familiar with this debate, here is a very popular example from this literature. So what you see here is the mechanism for the propagation of the action potential. So at the top, you can see the axon along which the action potential is propagated, and below that you see its mechanism. So that means different ion channels opening and closing in a certain temporal order, and then ions influxing and thereby changing the membrane potential, which then leads to the propagation of the action potential. I mean, there are more details, but it's not too important. So based on examples like these, many different authors in the literature have suggested different characterizations of what a mechanism might be, and I think more or less people agree now on something like that. Mechanisms are entities and activities organized such that they are responsible for a phenomenon. And entities in this example are, for example, the ion channels and the ions. The activities is the opening and closing and the influxing, for example. Organization plays an important role, so you need to have a certain spatial organization of these components and a temporal organization, but also some kind of causal organization and a hierarchical organization, which I'm going to explain in a minute. Now this notion of being responsible for is maybe intentionally vague. Usually what is meant here is either being causally responsible or being constitutively responsible. I'm going to say a little bit on that in a minute. Okay, so the new mechanistic approach gives us the following hierarchical view of the different phenomena in the life sciences. So again, back to our example, at the top level you have the phenomenon, which is the neurons firing. At the level below you have the mechanism for it, and this is composed of different components, which are the entities and activities. So this is one version of a very popular diagram that is used in this literature. And now these arrows are supposed to be somehow causal connections between the components. And what is crucial here is that each component itself can be viewed as a phenomenon that is due to a mechanism. So you have mechanisms all the way down until the maybe fundamental level. So now, when looking at the literature, the notion of a mechanism seems to play two roles. And one is in the context of explanation. So here, people argue that our explanations, they mention mechanisms in some sense. And in this context, mechanisms are composed of those things that are explanatory relevant with respect to a given explanandum or with respect to a given phenomenon. So when we talk about mechanisms in the context of explanation, here the question is, what is explanatory relevant? Well, it's the mechanism. So when using the term mechanism in this context, I want to speak of explanatory mechanism. But on the other hand, from the very beginning, this literature was also influenced by metaphysical considerations. So here, for example, McCardaden and Krickel argue that the world is made out of mechanisms. So all there is entities and activities, and they interact and thereby produce phenomena. And on the other hand, mechanisms are what we actually intervene on. So if you conduct experiments, then we intervene, for example, on the particular mechanism for an action potential and see what happens when we change certain parameters. So when we talk about mechanisms in this context, we're interested in the question, what is there? Well, there are mechanisms. And when we speak of mechanisms in this context, I want to speak of metaphysical mechanisms. Okay, so based on these two rules, the question arises, well, how do they relate? How is the notion of an explanatory mechanism and that of a metaphysical mechanism, how do they relate? And one idea is often formulated in the mechanistic literature is that somehow explanatory mechanisms are descriptions of metaphysical mechanisms. Metaphysical mechanisms are the truth makers of explanatory mechanisms, so they are truth makers of our explanations. And this is similar to what Krickel and Kaplan have called the model to mechanism mapping requirement. Those of you who know that will know what I mean here. The details are not important. I think it's a combination of these two problems, these two conditions. But I think that there is a problem, because the explanatory mechanism and the metaphysical mechanism with regard to a certain phenomenon, they do not necessarily match. So you cannot simply say that one is a description of the other. And I think so for two reasons. So I think we are confronted here with two challenges. The first is that not everything that is part of the metaphysical mechanism is part of the explanatory mechanism. So in other words, not everything that is out there will be mentioned in an explanation. And the second challenge is not everything that is part of the explanatory mechanism is part of the metaphysical mechanism. So in other words, not everything that is mentioned in an explanation is, in the strict sense, out there. It's not metaphysically real. Okay, so what I want to do is to briefly explain to you what I think what metaphysical mechanisms are in more detail. Then I want to present what I think what explanatory mechanisms are, then elaborate on the two challenges, and then at least indicate how I think these challenges can be met in this metaphysical, in this mechanistic framework. Okay, so what is a metaphysical mechanism? So I think when going back to this general picture, this picture can be interpreted in a metaphysical way and also in an explanatory way. And if we give this a metaphysical interpretation, then what we refer to as the phenomenon or as the components is what Marie Kaiser and I, and also in the book, I elaborate on that, call entity-involving activities. I will say more on that in a minute. And mechanisms then are systems or collections of these entity-involving occurrence. The vertical relation then is called constitution. And the causal interactions are spelled out in terms of activity causation. And all these yellow notions I'm going to elaborate on in a minute. But also this is, so to speak, the main purpose of the book I presented at the beginning. There I developed these notions in more detail. Okay, so let's start with entity-involving activities. What's that? So it stems from an idea that was presented by McNamara, Darden, and Craver in this very famous paper from the year 2000. So it is, on the one hand, saying that human supervenience or a static block universe view are wrong, or like just the view that there are just entities or substances out there, because this won't give you any dynamics. And the metaphysics that gives you the dynamics is process ontology, but this is still wrong because, according to their argument, this doesn't provide you with any spatial structure. And this is why they introduced the term entity-activity dualism. I don't want to defend entity-activity dualism against these alternative metaphysical views. I will just assume it and see how far we can get with that. Okay, so the notion of entity-involving activity is supposed to capture this idea of an entity-activity dualism, but it is supposed to stress a few more claims, namely, on the one hand, activities do not occur without entities that engage in them. So, for example, the activity of opening is not just a free-floating activity, there needs to be an entity that is opening. But also vice versa, entities are necessarily engaged in occurrent. So here we introduce the notion of an occurrent, which is just the umbrella term for all things out there that are extended in time, like states, events, or processes. And this is why we talk about entity involving occurrent. So every entity out there is involved in an occurrent. I am standing here, you are sitting there, someone is walking, red is navigating a maze, and so on. And I'm going to use the abbreviation EIO to refer to these entities. Just as a side remark, for some people, this is just what some people call events. We don't want to use the notion of an event because it's ambiguous, as you all know, and this is why we introduced this technical term. Okay, and now some of these entity involving occurrence contain activities, so some entities are involved in activities. And I think I'm going to say more on that, but maybe we can come to that in the Q&A. Okay, so very importantly, the mechanistic ontology thereby is a singularist ontology, so all there is are concrete particulars. Okay, so this is just a brief explanation of what I take entity involving occurrence to be. For those of you who don't like the term, just think of events. It's just important that you always have an entity doing something. Okay, so let's come to the second notion, activity causation. So activity causation was something that was introduced by many new mechanists and also early or old mechanists. But so far, no one has really explained what that means. But I think some general features can be listed. So it's a singularist notion of causation. So token causal claims are prior to type causal claims. It is empirical. What I mean by that is it is supposed to be a theory about what causation is in this world and not necessarily in all other worlds. It is a metaphysical notion. What I mean by this is it's about something that is happening out there, so it's independent of our epistemic capacities. And it is non-relational, and what I mean by that is that so causal interactions do not consist of relation between events. And this is something that is shared by many so-called process or people that defend process theories of causation. I don't want to say too much here because we don't need all the details, but just to point into the directions of where I'm developing this theory in the book. So I take bits of Stuart Glennon's theory of mechanistic causation, bits of Wesley Selman's theory and other theories, and introduce three notions that are fundamental to what I call activity causation, which is the notion of an active entity involving occurrent. And just very roughly, this is an entity involving occurrent, for example, me walking around. And it is an active entity involving occurrent. If it is constituted by a lower level mechanism, that means if it is constituted or it is due to something that happens inside of me. So if in normal cases of walking will be active entity involving occurrence, but there are also non-active entity involving occurrence. So basically, if you just push me around, this behavior is due to something external, and therefore it is not something I actively do. And the third notion is that of a mechanistic interaction. So very roughly, it is when entity involving occurrence intersect, and at the area of overlap, there is again a constituting mechanism, and then there are different cases depending on which kinds of entity involving occurrence overlap. Okay. The details are not too important here. It's just to point to the fact that there is or some ideas of how to develop a theory of activity causation. Okay, so let's come to the third notion, constitution, so which is supposed to be the vertical relation, so mechanisms constitute higher level phenomena. So what does that mean? Again, some general features. So I think constitution is best spelled out as a singularist notion, so again, token claims about constitution prior to type claims, and again, it's a metaphysical notion in the sense that it is about something out there independent of us. So, and then there is one necessary condition for constitution. So a metaphysical mechanism constitutes a phenomenon only if it occurs in the same space-time region. So, I don't know, the mechanism involving my muscles constitutes my walking only if it is contained inside of me, if it's in the same space-time region, and if it's somewhere else, then it cannot be the mechanism responsible for it, or the constitutive mechanism. But I think from a metaphysical point of view, not much else can be said. So I argue that it's an irreducible aspect of entity involving occurrence. Some in the right take will constitute others and some don't, but luckily we can still empirically determine which constitutes which by means of interventions. Okay, so this was a rush through this metaphysical picture. Just as a side remark, based on this metaphysical interpretation of the mechanistic account, I also argue that this famous Craver diagram has to be modified. So this is what I take to be a better description or a better diagram of mechanisms. So you have two spatial axes. I cannot move towards there because then the microphone is too far away. And this is a temporal axis. So for example, you have a two-dimensional me walking around. So this is the entity involving occurrence, and this contains a mechanism that again is composed of different entity involving occurrence that interact in a certain way and is constituted by it. Okay. So what then is an explanatory mechanism? So this, I think, is, our world is full of these things. This is what I argue. So what is an explanatory mechanism? So again, we can start with this picture and look at it from an explanatory perspective. And in the literature, usually when people talk about explanation in this literature, they talk about these components being variables and mechanisms then being models, causal models of variables. The notion of constitution then is replaced by the notion of constitutive relevance, which, like causation, is spelled out in terms of Woodwardian interventionism. So it's about wiggling variables and seeing what happens. Again, I don't have time to go into details here. I think many of you are familiar with interventionism, and those of you who don't, it's not too important. It's just that they implement a different notion of causal relevance when talking about explanation. Just some very general remarks about explanatory mechanisms. So I argue that explanatory mechanisms are models or other types of representations that have the purpose of explaining a phenomenon. As I said, metaphysical mechanisms are their truth makers, but apart from that, there are certain what I call mechanistic criteria for a good theory of explanatory mechanisms. So something that most defenders of this approach, I think, would assume. Namely, on the one hand, so a theory of mechanistic explanation or explanatory mechanisms has to be descriptively adequate. So somehow it has to account for what scientists are actually doing. So somehow it has to start with looking at actual science and then developing philosophical theories. Another commitment is, I think, that explanation is characterized as the endeavor that we do in order to uncover how a phenomenon is situated in the causal structure of the world. And we do so, or the motivation for thinking this about explanation, so this is the only purpose of explanation, because we want to explain phenomena in order to control them or control the world or know how to intervene to, I don't know, heal people, to develop new devices and so on. And based on that, explanation is kept apart from different scientific endeavors, like, for example, mere description, prediction, increasing understanding, at least in a more psychological sense, and so on. I will just accept that here, that explanation, so we just assume for the sake of argument that this is what the term explanation is supposed to do, namely pick out exactly that scientific endeavor. But exactly here, the problem arises. So if we want to stick to the first two claims, the problem arises that explanatory mechanisms cannot be descriptions of the metaphysical mechanisms where each variable maps onto a mechanistic component and vice versa. And the reason is exactly these two challenges that I briefly introduced at the beginning. So to repeat the two challenges, the first one is not everything that is part of the metaphysical mechanism is part of the explanatory mechanism. And three examples come to mind that I think point to different aspects here. Namely, first, the particular size, speed, or whatever of the ions or other entities is explanatory irrelevant for the action potential. So when we explain the action potential, like typical examples or typical and instances of this explanation, they won't mention all the details about the different ions and the ion channels that are involved, so they will ignore certain features. Secondly, the particular type of cation is irrelevant. There needs to be a change of the membrane voltage. Assume the action potential occurred, neurotransmitters are released, and we want to know how does that happen. And as a matter of fact, I think it's calcium or something that influxes into the axon and then causes some ion channels to open and so on. And now it is argued it doesn't matter that it is this particular ion that influxes. It's just important that for the explanation that the membrane voltage is changed. And a third example, quarks are explanatory irrelevant for the action potential. So again, if explanations really just map onto the mechanisms out there and mechanisms are hierarchical and go down to the fundamental level, then in some sense the mechanism for the action potential also contains quarks. But if we explain the action potential, usually people would say what quarks are doing is not relevant. Or even if you go to even higher levels, like explaining psychological capacities, no one would think that the activities of quarks or whatever quarks are doing is important here. Okay, so I think these are three instances of the first challenge. The second challenge is one example. Often what is not happening is explanatory relevance. So often when we, want to explain why someone got sick, and we want to say, oh, well, because the medication, something went wrong, something did not happen that we wanted to happen. This explains why this person got sick. Okay, and now for the rest of my talk, I want to tell you how I think these challenges can be met, so how we can save the mechanistic picture of mechanisms being out there and explanation somehow mentioning mechanisms while accounting for these two challenges. Okay, so let's start with the first. Not everything that is part of the metaphysical mechanism is part of the explanatory mechanism, and our first case was, well, the particular features of, for example, the ions, they don't matter for the explanation of the action potential. One reply here is, yeah, that's right. Even though the ions and ion channels, they have these particular features, we don't have to mention them in our explanation, and this is fine with the mechanistic account because, well, many explanations explain phenomena types. So for example, when we want to explain the action potential, we are usually interested, or often interested, in how does the action potential in general work, and not this particular action potential here. And if it is about types, then, well, we mention only those features that all and only the token metaphysical mechanisms that are subsumed under the same type description have in common. So if we want to explain how does the action potential work in general, we only look at different instances of the mechanism that actually produced the action potential, and then in the explanation we mention only those features that they have in common and that they do not share with cases where the action potential did not occur. And clearly, there are cases where the action potential did not occur, and the ions, they didn't change, their size or their speed. So that shows that it is also the case in cases where the action potential does not occur, and therefore it is not mentioned in the type level explanation. Secondly, explananda are contrastive. So this is also something that Crave and Kaplan have recently argued in order to argue against the so-called more details better objection. So usually our explanatory requests have the form of, for example, why did the action potential have feature X rather than Y? I don't know, why did the action potential peak with this millivolts and not some other value? And here we only mention those features of the metaphysical mechanisms that satisfy two conditions. Namely, we mention those features that differ between the actual mechanism, so the one that brings about the phenomenon with this particular feature X, and the most similar mechanism that brings about the phenomenon, but with the contrast feature. And also we mention only those, or these features are mentioned that are shared by all instances of the mechanism that bring about the phenomenon with feature Y. So for example, so if we're interested in why the action potential peaked at a certain value and not at some other, we look at all the cases of the mechanism that induced a peak of the contrast with a contrast value, and pick out the one that is most similar to the actual case. And then we describe the differences that between the actual case and that contrastive case, and mention those features that are different and shared by all the contrast mechanisms. Okay, so this is also a paper I'm currently working on with my PhD student, so if you want to know more, I can also send you the manuscript. And I think this idea that explanations, that explananda are contrastive, will also help to solve the second issue. So as a matter of fact, the metaphysical mechanism contained this certain cation, I don't know, calcium, but our intuition is we don't have to mention that it was calcium that influxes, but only that something happened that induced this change in the membrane voltage. Well, it can be shown that the change in the membrane voltage is the feature that all the contrast cases have in common, and therefore we mention it in the explanation, because there will be cases of the neurotransmitter release where neurotransmitters are released, but it's not calcium that is that influxes, but some other cation. And thirdly, quarks are explanatory irrelevant for neurotransmitter release. So again, the metaphysical mechanism will contain quarks. The explanatory mechanism won't, because the quarks are not explanatory relevant to this phenomenon. And here the idea is that explanation aims at finding crucial points of intervention. So remember, the new mechanists think that explanation is motivated by our need to, or our desire to control the world and intervene into mechanisms. And so the idea is that an explanation is better if the points of intervention that we find are crucial in the sense that it will be will not create a lot of effort to conduct these interventions. So an example, so suppose we want to know how we can intervene into the action potential such that X happens rather than Y, such that it peaks with a certain value rather than another. And the idea is now that we have to stop at the level of the mechanistic hierarchy, for which it is true that going further down will not make interventions easier. So at some point, the intervention, so I don't know, intervening into quarks in order to change what the action potential is doing will be rather difficult, but intervening into ions will be much easier. Therefore, stopping at the ion, or at the level where we mentioned the ions, this will be enough. So this is the intuition behind this approach. Okay, so this is my answers to the first challenge. So how we can uphold the idea that explanatory mechanisms are in some sense explanations of in some sense descriptions of metaphysical mechanisms, but descriptions that respect the type level of the explanation, the fact that they are contrastive, and the fact that we need crucial points of intervention. So let's come very briefly to the second. Okay, maybe not. So not everything that is part of the explanatory mechanism, should I do something or not stop doing something? Okay. Okay, that's a nice example also. So often what is not happening is explanatory relevant. So take the following case. So usually, so this is an enzyme and an antibiotic binding to it, and because it binds, or the enzyme binds to it, that was too quick maybe. Let's do it again. So because it binds to it, it will change its structure, and therefore a certain substrate cannot bind to it. So that's the mechanism of how antibiotics influence or stop diseases. And now, based on this example, we can make or we can formulate sentences like, the disease developed because the antibiotic did not bind to the enzyme, or the antibiotic was removed, which led to the substrates binding to the enzyme. So here, these are examples where we explain a certain phenomenon, namely the occurrence of a disease, by something that did not happen. But the issue now is that not binding is not an activity that exists in any interesting way. But still, the metaphysical mechanism is supposed to be the truth maker of this explanation, and how is that possible? So this is a very common problem in theories of causation, so the so-called omission problem. So let's just very briefly look at this example. The disease developed because the antibiotic did not bind to the enzyme. So this is now the case. The red thing, the antibiotic did not bind, therefore the substrate bound, which therefore induced the disease. Okay, so the first condition is the state of the enzyme is such that it's incompatible with there being antibiotic being bound to it. Well, the site where the antibiotic usually binds is there. So there are certain other molecules, or I don't know, whatever molecules are surrounding the enzyme. Secondly, the substrate binds to the enzyme, which constitutes the start of the disease. So this is also something that is actually happening. The substrate, which is the bluish thing, it actually binds to the enzyme and then triggers some mechanism that causes the disease. And here the idea is that explanation has a lot to do with violation of expectation. So we expect that the antibiotic binds to the enzyme due to statistical regularities, inertia, or function. So here it probably functions. So we invented the antibiotic and we gave it to the patient in order to prevent the disease. So that's what we expected. And violations of expectations are the things that we mention in explanations. So these are the explanatory interesting issues. On the other hand, the second claim formulates a fulfillment of an expectation. So we expect substrates to bind to enzymes if there are no antibiotics attached to it. So this, because our expectation here is fulfilled, we do not mention it in the explanandum because it's not the explanatory interesting thing. So I think if we introduce this idea of a violation of expectation to the a theory of explanatory mechanisms, we can solve that issue. Okay, so this is just a summary of what I think the world looks like. So the colorful tubes are the entity involving occurrence. Some of them overlap and interact. Some of them are constituted by further entity involving occurrence. And now these black circles are the things that we pick out by our explanations, so the explanatory mechanisms. And they are still made true by the metaphysical picture underlying it if we respect conditions about the explananda being about generalization, contrast, or violated expectations. And that's it. Thank you very much. Do you want to start here?
No, because I don't have my slides there. All my stuff there. Ah. Should I just disconnect this?
Yeah.
I need that.
Ah, no, there's a different cable.
to be very brief, because I think I need to be very brief. So I want to make 2 points. One is on this EIO, entity involving occurrence. So this is actually from the chapter, I read the whole chapter, not just this one. So, Krickel's definition of temporal part, this is about perdurance and EIO. So first is her definition of temporal part from EIO. She also gives a definition of the spatial part. And what I'm interested here in is number 1. So the entity involved in EIO1 is identical with the entity involved in EIO2. So these are her examples of entity-activity dualism, where we have entities doing something. Right? Forget about the second condition, I'm not going to talk about it. So Krickel's EA dualism is based on her defining occurrent as thing that perdures and continuum as thing that endures. Things perdure by having temporal parts. Events are good examples. Football games, their existence is such that they are made up of temporal parts. Okay? And then we have continuance, which intuitively, let's say, like this computer would be a continuum because it is entirely there at each time when it exists. Now this is incompatible with perdurantism, according to which everything perdures. So there are only occurrences in Krickel's sense and other people's sense. Now this is not a problem, you don't need to be a perdurantist, right? But, so you could say, so what? You might say, why not be a perdurance-endurance dualist, right? Now this would be okay if Krickel provided a good argument as to why we believe in enduring entities. She offers an intuitive example in the chapter, which I think you mentioned yourself here, walking. In the chapter is a car moving, right? And the idea is that the car, the moving, that's the occurrent part, and that's what that produces because it's an event. The car itself is a self-identical entity at any time during its running on the road. Now, things are not so intuitive, however, with other types of entities. Take, for example, yourself, the organism that you are. So as David Lewis put it, you are your career. Now, some people think this is counterintuitive. This is a literature on personal identity. Some people think this is counterintuitive, that, you know, I'm not my career. But to me, it seems intuitive. Why? Because arguably, you know, this example is better suited for perdurantism. So your entire life, you are breathing, your heart is beating, you sweat, you move, you talk, you get hotter, colder, you metabolize, you shed skin, your neurons fire, etc. Your whole life is activity, right? So you do seem to be an occurrent, not a continuum. Anyhow, if rheology, which is a subfield of physics that deals with the flow of matter, if its Heraclitean principles are true, which is that everything flows, right? Everything is an occurrent. So including cars, rocks, mountains, planets, you just need a different time scale, much longer time scale to observe the mountains flowing. You need hundreds of billions of years and you will see the mountains flow. The second point I want to make is about omissions, absences, causation, and causal explanation. So first, Krickel correctly distinguishes between what the mechanism does and how we describe it, or between ontology and explanation. When it comes to the causal relevance of omissions and absences in general, she appeals to a psychological factor, namely expectation. Right? Cases of causation by omission or absence are then accounted for by way of describing what happened as contrary to expectation P, right? PM. And this is a more Sartrean approach to absence. Sartre correctly identified the main problem with absences, which is that there are too many of them, and only some of them are relevant when we actually mention them in causal explanations. He has a famous example with Pierre in the cafe. He goes into the cafe and doesn't see Pierre, and says, I notice Pierre's absence. But of course, a lot of other things are absent. Millions, infinitely many things are absent from the cafe. The Pope is absent from the cafe, but I notice Pierre's absence. How do we explain this? Well, Pierre was expected to be there. So I kind of deontologized and psychologized the idea of absence, which is very nice if you don't want to believe in absence, if you are, you have a phobia of, if you're a nominalist or something like that. I like absences, but most people probably don't like them. So here's another example. So sometimes absences are both expected, not unexpected, and causally explanatory. So that's myself at home in my home studio, and this is an almost true story. It's Beethoven Fifth, where in the very first, the way it begins, there's a pause, there's a silence, right? If you don't play that silence, if you don't allow that silence, you're not playing Beethoven Fifth. And someone is knocking the door while this symphony plays in my headphones, very loud. I happen to hear that someone's knocking on my door because of the pause. Pause. Okay, and this actually happens with me many times. People ring my phone rings, and I'm listening to stuff. And when there are breaks, I hear, oh, I have to go. So here it looks like, because this is the symphony, this absence of sound is expected, right? And nevertheless, it's causally relevant. Here's a bit better example. So anxiolytics like Xanax, which is a benzodiazepine, they act by increasing the amount of GABA neurotransmitters, thus decreasing the transmission of nerve messages. So Xanax increases the amount of GABA that binds to its receptors and opens the channel for chloride to pass into the cell. Increasing chloride in the nerve cell can slow or even block transmission of nerve messages. Now the result is a feeling of calm, drowsiness, slowness, sluggishness, right? This is a typical case of causation by disconnection, which Jonathan Sheffer wrote about. And so we can say correctly, so the blocking or absence of nerve transmission causes the feeling of calm. But what is expected here? Is it that you are anxious, or is it that you are calm? What is the default expectation? There is no clear answer. If the former, then Krickel's recipe works, and we say that the absence of neurotransmission, contrary to expectation, causes the feeling of calm. So we again psychologize and deontologize the absence. This is the Sartrean way. But if the latter, then we have objective absence as a cause. Now the problem is, who sets the standard? What is the default? Is there such a thing as the normal psychological state to be in? Am I supposed to be calm? I'm speaking now in front of you. I don't think I'm supposed to be calm, right? Right? Or too calm. I am supposed to be a bit excited, right? Maybe not overexcited. So the idea is that you have these two states for the yoga guy who's very calm, and you have the anxious guy. But in itself, the theory doesn't tell you which one should be the default, and you need a default in order to assert that something happens contrary to expectation. So that's roughly what I have to comment about.
Yes, thank you very much. Can I briefly reply? There was really a lot. Maybe I just reply to your last examples. So so in your last example, so the expectation concerned the explanans, not the explanandum. So if you want to explain why are you calm and explain that in terms of an absence, then the expectation that tell you that you have to mention the absence is the fact that there is some kind of expectation about something else happening that doesn't make it an absence. So the expectation always concerns the mechanism, not the phenomenon. But you're right, so I need to say more on what these expectations are supposed to be. So sometimes it's really social expectations. So my neighbor didn't water my plants, well, Obama didn't do it either, but it's not Obama's fault, but my neighbor's fault, well, because there was this social expectation that my neighbor did it. But then there are also, in the non-social realm, we have to have a different notion of expectation, and this can be statistical regularity, or what I call inertia, so something like, the expectation is that things stay the same. And if this expectation is violated, then this might lead to mentioning of an omission. Or, as I said, the function, so an expectation is due to the fact, because we either, it it is an artifact that is designed such that it fulfills a function, or maybe there is some kind of biological function. So there are different notions of expectation, but I think you're right. It has to be said more on, in which case, which expectation is relevant and what the expectation really says. So I have to think about the concrete examples in more detail, especially this causation by disconnection is, of course, a crucial and difficult case. Yeah, and your discussion of purism, I think you're right. I mean, there's a huge ontological or metaphysical debate on that. And as I said, also in the book, I don't argue for that a lot because other people do that. And I just said, okay, the new mechanists, for some reason, they want to stick to this idea of entities and activities. I mean, I think even if in the end everything is an occurrent, I think that's closer to what they want to say, because this dynamical aspect is very important. It turns out that there are no entities. Yeah, I mean, maybe, yeah, you're right. I haven't argued for that.
Okay,
yeah.
I want to allow other people to ask questions. So, yeah.
So, go back to the mic. Maybe just a broad question. Where you explain the epistemological mechanisms is very pragmatically oriented, as it is. If we want to know why this thing came about and what happens if we intervene in here and so on and so forth. But metaphysical mechanism is not supposed to be pragmatic, right? It's supposed to be about truth, the way things are. So I wonder, in this broad question, right? So apologies, how do you get from the epistemic mechanisms from the metaphysical mechanisms? Since it seems that you have most cases you have maybe innumerable different mechanisms which take the phenomena under it. Which one is primary? How do you know that in the bottom level there really are mechanisms or entities as constituents of these? How do you know that there's plurality of mechanisms? So I'm really asking about the methodology, that you have methodological explanations in any pragmatic context. Then there's this deeper claim that deep down it's all mechanisms, it's entities interacting. So how do you get there?
Okay, so the question is, how do I get from like real explanations to this metaphysical view that there are mechanisms, right? Okay, so of course certain details about this metaphysical picture are justified in that way. So people have started talking about mechanisms in the metaphysical sense because they observed that many scientists talk about mechanisms. And they have then looked at the different examples of the explanation and said, okay, we should distinguish between entities and activities and so on. But of course, the then more substantial metaphysical claim, and therefore there are entities and activities out there, is going beyond this mere description of what scientists are doing. So somehow there is this more or less naive realism in the background that says, okay, our metaphysics has to stick as closely as possible to what scientists are talking about. But of course, metaphysics gives us some other restrictions, like I think it gives you singularism, it gives you absences are not real, and then you come into all these problems of how you then combine this metaphysical view where there are just concrete particulars and no absences, how then to map that back onto the explanatory practice. You're not convinced?
I guess my puzzlement or question is really about the individuation of mechanisms, since it seems so pragmatically oriented in the case of explanation, but it shouldn't be in the metaphysical case. Otherwise, it's not sort of metaphysics proper, I suppose.
Yeah, so I think it is just a fact of the world also that there is some vagueness. So if you speak about the mechanism for the action potential, there is not this like concrete thing with this like clear boundaries. But I think this is a property of our language. So if we talk about mountains, the term mountain doesn't give us the clear boundaries of where the mountain starts and stops. But still there is a matter of fact of if there is an instance of the action potential, some entities and activities are constituted. And how
if there are entities, if they are ambiguous, if there is true ambiguity in the world, what
yeah, we can discuss that later if you want.
Okay, I move on to Stanley.
Well, just a follow-up really. So, in this literature, I've always read Kramer and other guys as providing a rather, starting with rather compelling assumptions about how science is practiced, where science is exactly life sciences mirror neuroscience, psychology, parts of biology. But now, this picture that you mentioned about, and that was the trouble now, right? Mechanisms all the way down. I mean, that simply doesn't match how modern physics is done. Entities such as quarks, unless my physics is vastly wrong, right? I mean, they are not really mechanisms, and there is no real sense you can attach to them being part of mechanisms.
Yeah.
So much of the motivation will be lost if you go all the way down to fundamental physics and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, this seems to be like maybe a general criticism of this hierarchical picture. So, for example, Stuart Glennon works a lot on especially this issue that if there is a fundamental level, and it is very likely a physical level, and there are, I don't know, quantum effects and so on, does this talking about mechanisms still make sense? And I mean, there are basically two options. In one sense, if there's a fundamental level, then this cannot be due to a mechanism. So here we have to have a plan B of how to make sense of that. And then there's this question, is the metaphysics of physics really compatible with this view? And I think there are different answers. So on the one hand saying, okay, if we want to stick to a higher level metaphysics or a higher level ontology in terms of entities and activities, but the lowest level ontology doesn't contain them, we either have to tell a story of how you get entities and activities from whatever is down there, or we have to show how we can make sense of the ontology of physics in this sense. Yeah, you're right. I think it's an open problem or an open discussion for this hierarchical view of mechanisms. So, yeah, I restrict myself in the book on the metaphysics of biology and think, okay, I mean, I mentioned it, some people think about the ontology of physics. There needs to be another book about how these metaphysics, the higher level metaphysics and lower level relate. But yeah, I think you're right.
So I'm afraid this must be the last question, the gentleman there, because we are kind of, it's already half past. We should start the next talk as well.
So this is maybe a more aggressive version of the first point. So I take it that one of the games, certainly that Krickel is playing, is it's really important that the explanation is spontaneous, right, in the world. And you see lots of very sensible things about the pragmatics of explanation. But the more you push things into pragmatics of explanation, the more it looks like, well, it's the epistemology that's carrying the explanation. It's not the world, right? The real fundamental explanatory thing is that I'm meeting your contrastive needs, these kinds of things. And so I guess there's another way of going, which is instead of pushing into the pragmatics, push into the metaphysics. Just go bloody with your metaphysics, right? So at least in 2007, Krickel was like, hey, phenomena are multiply decomposable, right? Which you could read as, there are lots and lots of mechanisms in the world. They're overlapping, they're nested, they're all over the place. There's a whole lot of mechanisms for me to pick when I'm going and doing my explanation. So instead of saying I'm partially describing a mechanism, right, which is putting it into, as it were, pragmatics, you can say, oh, there's just a heap ton of mechanisms all over the place, and they're cross-cutting in various ways. And when I'm doing my explanation, I'm picking the right one for you, and that lets you keep the onset power. There may be some other costs.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think one way of putting what I'm doing is criticizing the ontic view of explanation. So I think this is wrong, and I think many things that Carl Craven now says, like admitting that explanations are often contrastive. I mean, it's unclear how that should be combined with that view. But I think still the assumption that our explanations should be true, and they are made true by metaphysical mechanisms, but on top of that, not just any description of the mechanism is a good explanation, but a certain kind of description that obeys certain other norms. This will be the good explanation, which is made true by the metaphysical mechanism. Yeah.
Okay, maybe the last one.
Connecting this talk to the previous talk, would you care to say anything about the very tense relationship between functional individuation as it figures in biology and the theses of mechanism about constitution?
So how the functional... So first of all, I think I agree that certain functional explanations, they can be also viewed as mechanistic explanation in that sense, so that they are made true by certain mechanisms, but what it is explanatory relevant is just highlighting certain features that are, I don't know, relevant given the contrast that we are interested in. How that relates to constitution?
In particular, because the functions are almost always multiply realized, and the multiple realization breaks up the neat mechanism picture that Graeber and others offer us.
So of course that means that there is not, or that the mechanism type is individuated, or what the tokens, all the tokens that bring about this functional phenomenon, or that phenomenon that is individuated functionally, everything they share is a certain higher level feature, a certain structural feature, whatever. In the details they all differ, and therefore we don't mention these details in the explanation, but still out there, if in a concrete case, there will be an implementing mechanism that has these features. It's just not interesting for the explanation because we're interested in this more abstract functional description of the phenomenon.
Isn't that really incompatible with the principle that you extracted from Graeber and Kaplan? What is it called?
More details are better.
Yes.
Objection, yeah. Yeah, I think that is exactly one reply to the more details are better explanation. I mean, if you just reject the ontic view of explanation and saying explanation has to satisfy further norms, like we are interested in these contrasts, so we mention only what is relevant given these contrasts. Yeah.
Okay, so let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.